want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Jason Riley. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our symposium today, which is titled Prospects for Black America. Before we get started, I wanted to thank a few people, starting with Larry Mohn, who heads the Manhattan Institute and who signed off on this event. I also want to thank Dean Ball, Lee Harrington, Taisha Camacho, and Debbie Ezard, who handled everything from contacting the panelists to securing the venue, and I want to thank them for their hard work as well. This is our third annual symposium, and the idea is to bring together people with different points of view about addressing racial problems in America. You'll be hearing from some Democrats, some Republicans, some liberals, some conservatives, but most importantly, you'll be hearing from people who've given some serious thought to these issues and don't dismiss out of hand people who think differently from them. Everyone here is here to engage. You'll also be hearing from people who aren't afraid to touch some third rails. That's what the Manhattan Institute specializes in to some extent, touching third rails, not shying away from the more difficult and uncomfortable public policy questions like those surrounding race. And it's not because we want to provoke for the sake of being provocative. It's because you can't really begin to address many of these difficult and complicated issues if you shy away from asking the difficult and complicated questions. Last month, some reporters approached the actor Denzel Washington at a screening of his new film, in which he plays a defense attorney. He was asked whether it was possible for blacks to improve their circumstances in the current political environment. Washington responded by saying, well, it starts in the home. If the father is not in the home, the boy will find a father in the streets. I saw it in my generation, in every generation before me, and everyone since. He said, if the streets raise you, then the judge becomes your mother, prison becomes your home. When he was asked to weigh in about race in the criminal justice system, he pretty much reiterated what he'd said before. He said it starts with how you raise your children. He said if a young man doesn't have a father figure, he'll go find a father figure. So you can't blame the system. It's unfortunate that we make such easy work for them. Now, Washington took some heat for those remarks, but I think they were on target by and large. So many of our discussions about racial inequality quickly turn into discussions about racial discrimination, and sometimes that makes sense. I have no doubt that racism still exists in America today and plays a role in the racial disparities that we see today. But I also believe that other factors play a role. And the question for me is to what extent racism explains these outcomes today and to what extent something else explains these outcomes. We have racial gaps in income, employment, schooling, poverty, and other areas. How much of it is due to discrimination and how much of it is due to other factors that we don't spend enough time discussing? It's not simply an academic question. The answers can impact where we focus our time and resources, both of which are limited. Some are so eager to automatically attribute all racial disparities either to current racism or to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow that they neglect or play down other plausible explanations. I think that's a mistake. The progress that blacks have made after leaving slavery and prior to the civil rights legislation of the 1960s doesn't receive a lot of attention. It will today, because I think it's instructive in considering racism impact on racial inequality. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, black marriage rates in the US were higher than white marriage rates. In the 1940s and 50s, black labor participation rates were higher than white labor participation rates. Black incomes grew at a much faster rate than white incomes during this period. The black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points between 1940 and 1970. The number of blacks in middle-class professions quadrupled over this period. In other words, racial gaps are narrowing. Steady progress was being made. The black homicide rate for men, for example, fell by 20 percentage points, or nearly 20 percentage points in the 1940s, and again, by a larger amount in the 1950s. All of these trends have since slowed, stalled, or in some cases even been reversed. But is racism the main reason? If the legacy of slavery and segregation is to blame for these black outcomes today, what explains the tremendous progress made by blacks just a generation removed from slavery and during Jim Crow? Again, racism still exists. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But citing it as a blanket explanation for racial inequality today, I think, is problematic. Previous generations of blacks faced far more significant racial barriers, yet managed to narrow black-white gaps in everything from income to home ownership to educational attainment. Racism didn't stop them. I hope we can delve into what may or may not be hampering black prospects today. That's the goal of this event. And we're going to start with a couple of panel discussions, followed by some Q&A. And then we're honored to have Dr. Ben Carson, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, offer some remarks and then take questions. So let's get started with the first panel, which will focus on education and education reform in particular. And I'll sit down with our panelists. Let's see, the mic's still on. Can everyone still hear me? Yes. Okay. So to my immediate left is Jarrell Bradford. He is the Executive Vice President of the organization 50 CAN and a longtime education reform advocate. That's how we first met over the years, discussing issues like charter schools and vouchers and so forth. He frequently contributes to education debates in print, digital, radio, and TV media. He serves on several boards dedicated to putting the needs of students and families first, including the Success Academy charter schools here in New York. To Jarrell's left is Mark Whitaker, whose bio I have here somewhere. Mark is the author of memoir, My Long Trip Home, and Smoketown, which he'll tell us a little bit about. Mark is a journalist, like yours truly, former managing editor of CNN, where he was previously the Washington Bureau for NBC News, and a reporter and editor at Newsweek, where he rose to become the first African-American leader of a national news weekly. So I think we can all agree that race relations are in a pretty bad place right now in America. We can probably also all agree that the current president hasn't helped matters. But I would also argue that he inherited a bad situation. This didn't start with him, even if he has not improved matters or may have made matters worse. I think if you look at polls on race relations coming out of the last administration, they showed things in a pretty bad place, probably the worst since the Rodney King riots back in the early 1990s. I wonder if either of you have any thoughts on how we got here, and then how we might turn things around.
Well, you know, the first thing I would say is that I think there is a vast difference between the state of urban black America, blacks who live in what were once, thriving northern sort of industrial cities. And this is the subject of my book. It's about the black community of Pittsburgh from the 20s until the late 50s and early 60s, when this small community, by comparison with Harlem and Chicago and so forth, produced the largest black newspaper in America, some of the greatest black baseball teams, a sports writer who led the fight to integrate the major leagues and introduced Jackie Robinson to Branch Rickey, some of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century, August Wilson, America's greatest black playwrights, all came out of this tiny or relatively small industrial town. in Pittsburgh. And there were other black communities like that in Detroit, in Baltimore, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, et cetera, et cetera. I won't at the moment get into all the reasons, obviously, that those cities, in addition to those communities, decline. But those neighborhoods now are vastly worse off than they were 50 or 60 years ago, which is really quite extraordinary when you consider all the progress that we've made in America, just in general, economically, and in terms of standards of living and so forth. So I think you have to make a class distinction and also sort of a location distinction between black folks who are still living in those communities where situations are truly dire, and then the issues that confront middle-class blacks who, although there's still racism in Hollywood, there are still issues on campuses, there are still, problems, sort of in professional workplaces. But it's very hard to argue seriously that the black middle class, in terms of opportunity at least, is worse off than it was in terms of opportunity. So, a lot of the discussion of sort of race, let's have a conversation about race, seems to sort of suggest that the plight of black America is the same across all regional and class bounds. And I just don't buy that. I think that there is a terrible, terrible crisis in poor urban black America. And I think there are some issues that can be discussed in sort of, for the black middle class. But it's two very, very different situations.
Do you agree with that, Darrell, that when we talk about problematic race relations, we're really talking about the poor black communities, by and large, that are having these difficulties?
So first of all, I'd like to thank the Manhattan Institute and Jason Riley for inviting me here today. Normally, if it's the Manhattan Institute and we're talking about third rails, I'd expect Nicole Gallinas to be here talking about transportation policy. I think that there are like a million questions to answer in what Mark said and what you opened with, but I do want to say these two things. So the first one is I do think the situation for low-income black folks in cities that were once great, like Baltimore, where I am from, or Newark, where I used to work, or whatever, is kind of like wholly other. The economic and social conditions are ones that arrest progress, I feel like, in a way that may be unique to any place that isn't a post-industrial Rust Belt town filled with lots of people who aren't college educated. So there's probably interesting synergy between those two things that nobody talks very much about. The middle class thing, I think, is actually interesting too. There is a professor from Emory whose name escapes me, who did a study on the housing value, right? Because the value of houses for black property owners goes up slower than it does for white property owners. And what she found was that if you're black, you want to move someplace with some black people, but not too many. Because there's literally like a threshold above which the speed at which your property accrues is like drastically reduced compared to below that, right? And I mean, certainly there are lots of policies, schooling, redlining, lots of other things that have gone into creating that. But I would say that if you look at that and you want to ascribe it to a factor like race, because that's what the study was about, you do see that I think maybe uniquely, if not exclusively, like middle-income black folks are suffering from the legacies of prior policies driven by race in ways that maybe other folks aren't either. So I do think this is a problem that goes from top to bottom. It is felt with different levels of intensity based on where you are, who your parents were, how much money you make, but it is not one where one group of black folks feels it and the other group doesn't.
So it sounds like what you're saying is one of the more effective ways to probably improve race relations is is more black economic prosperity. That in and of itself would go a long ways towards repairing some of the damage here.
Yeah,
more jobs, higher incomes, and so forth in black communities.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's repairing, but whatever the black equivalent of is it like the the IRA, Sinn Féin, like us and us alone. Like, we need to figure out what that is. Because I've become deeply skeptical of like policymakers' ability to sort of like leverage like Black America writ large out of the mire that it is in economically right now. What I do see are, you know, particularly in education stuff, are, you know, schools and instances where like small groups of people are actually getting an opportunity to become their highest and best selves. And those people are changing the world, right? They're certainly changing their own worlds, right? And that is offered as something that is at the expense of everyone else, not to the betterment of like zero, which is what we're getting so often.
Well, go ahead.
Well, but you know, if you're talking about Black business, Black sort of self-help, not waiting for sort of the government necessarily to solve all the problems, you have to go back and talk about the fact that, again, in the period, you know, that you talked about in your introductory remarks, and then I've studied, you know, in Pittsburgh, you know, you had a community, really Black folks, entrepreneurial Black folks who, you know, cared about education, the smartest, the talented 10th, as Du Bois would say. They had no choice but to stay in those communities and to become leaders. And a lot of them opened businesses, and a lot of them, you know, pushed for better schools and so forth. One of the sort of perhaps perverse and slightly unintended consequences of the advances of the civil rights movement and also of affirmative action is that you had a whole generation. This is my father's generation because he was born in Pittsburgh. His parents, my grandparents ran funeral homes. But you know, he was able to leave Pittsburgh, go to college, become a professor, and he never came back. And he's one of many people that generation for whom that's true. So they had opportunities that they hadn't had in the sort of larger, still predominantly white world, and that was a good thing. But it was not a good thing for those communities because they were left without leadership.
So you're talking about what was happening under legal segregation, forced segregation at a time when I guess the government in many ways could at best be described as indifferent towards blacks, if not hostile toward blacks. We still hear talk of segregation today, society resegregating, and this gets into a lot of the education reform debate. Some of the best education reformers out there run schools that are largely Black and Hispanic. And the fact that they're achieving this academic success that is off the charts doesn't stop critics from saying they're segregated. And that's a bad thing, and that is reason enough to rethink some of these education reforms. What should trump what here? Are we more interested in the child learning or the child sitting next to a white kid in class? And you know, how do you respond to those criticisms, Darrell? I know you've, in your work in dealing in this sector, particularly the charter sector, you've come across this criticism.
Yeah, to the how do I respond to it? The answer is vociferously. So it's complicated. So like I had, you know, like grew up in the Pleistocene, also known as the '80s. And I was like the only Black kid at an all-white K-12 school. I went there from 7 to 12 on a scholarship, and it was an important thing that ever happened to me. But it was hard. I mean, it was extremely difficult. This said, I wouldn't trade it for anything. I feel like there is a currency about how to deal with the ruling order that you acquire when you are like in situations with people who are not like you, right? That said, like if you go to a Success Academy school, I recommend you do it, or you go to Uncommon or something like that, you will see kids who, when they talk to you, it's like the sun coming up, right? It's clear that there is something like amazing going on inside of them, and this happens regardless of who those kids sit next to. And this is being attacked, right? Like the people weren't assigned to these schools, right? Like a whole bunch of people who all happen to be Black or Hispanic decided to pick a school that mirrored their values, and the school is actually no more or less segregated than the neighborhood school next to it. So when that excellence has come into existence, that's under attack. So like black excellence is under attack. If you have like the lowest performing school where nobody is learning anything, you got to keep that open because that's all about community and democratic values, right? So to me, like what continues to evince itself in this whole process and the integration thing, I happen to support integration, but I think it's being held up as like it's the new poverty. Until we can integrate all the schools, we can't educate anybody. It used to be until everybody's making a living wage, you can't educate everybody. I do think we're sort of in a very dangerous place where we built policy, or we built a policy framework where it's okay to attack black excellence that is chosen versus supporting that. And we valorize schools that are basically like killing people who are destroying futures in the name of a whole bunch of values that actually aren't conveyed to the kids who attend them.
Do you have anything to add? Or?
No, I mean, I think that things are, bad enough that we just have to focus on what's best for the kids.
Yeah.
And that, it varies from kid to kid and from school to school. But there are definitely kids who benefit from being in a mostly black environment where, they feel a sense of identification with their teachers and with their classmates, and they don't feel the anxiety that necessarily feel in a white environment. There are other people like Darrell who you can throw at some point. Sometimes it's in grade school, sometimes it's a little later, in high school or in college, into a mixed environment, and they can thrive. I don't think black kids are. At some point, they have to learn that, we're still, a largely white society.
Totally
We're becoming more
agree.
diverse.
Totally agree.
But you're not being prepared for adult life if you don't have contact with white folks at some point.
Totally agree.
But the point at which you're thrown into that deep end, I think, varies on the kid.
Well, let's switch to higher education. And you talk about you want to sort of keep it real with these kids. And in college today, we're worried that they're living in these bubbles with their safe spaces and their trigger warnings. And you have organizations, activist groups like Black Lives Matter that are making a lot of headway on campus with these kids. There's a lot of frustration out there. We talked about the state of race relations that has certainly manifested itself on college campuses across the country. What do you make of this campus activism and what you see happening? And the role that black students are playing. A lot of blacks are leading these efforts to create these safe spaces, to tear down statues on campus and so forth. Is this helpful? Is this a positive development, or do you see some negative repercussions down the road here?
Well, on the one hand, I think that college in particular is a time for, experimentation with ideas, with identities. I think there are probably a lot of us who, were much more activist-minded in one way or another on different sides of the political spectrum and on different issues when we were that age than perhaps, people like Darrell sort of are still on the front lines, but not everybody is. So I'll say that first as a caveat. On the other hand, one advantage, the fact that we're at the Harvard Club here, is that I can actually talk about having gone to that institution as an undergraduate without feeling like a jerk. And, but I was there in the 70s, and I worked on the college newspaper, and my first beat in my career as a journalist was covering the admissions office. And this was the first generation. I was part of the first generation where there were actually enough black students at the campus that they could self-segregate. I mean, before that, it was, there were so few that it was really impossible. But you could have a black table. You could have a house that everybody in those days, I think it was Courier House up at the Quad, that everybody, where black folks sort of chose when you could, before the lottery, you could choose to go up there. And, a lot of my friends kind of lived that existence. And, I understood why they did, but what I also knew, because I was covering the admissions office and I had some pretty good sources there, is that most of them came from pretty much the same environments that the white kids did. They had gone to one of probably 30 or 40 really top prep schools in the country, private schools. And chances are, if they had gone to public school, you could identify, a half dozen, maybe 20 public schools, in different states where they were likely to have come. 70% of all students across all races came from that collection of schools. So they had already had the experience of dealing in a wide environment, but for some reason, and I understand some of the reasons, they wanted, once they got to Harvard, I guess, to feel like they just would spend most of the time with each other. And my feeling about it was, at least in terms of how I felt about my experience, that they were missing out. Because what I thought was great about college was the opportunity to meet people who I had never met and never would have met, in the environment, that I came from. And in terms of background, in terms of ideas, the college newspaper was a great place to do that because, so I think it's a little sad. I mean, you can get all kind of righteous about it and talk about either defending it or attacking it and so forth. But, college is it's 4 years in a life that you don't get back. And to not take full advantage of being exposed to as many different kinds of people and as many different ideas during that period, whether you're black or white, I think is a shame. I would say the same thing about white kids who go and, join a fraternity or sorority and never meet a black kid or a Hispanic kid or, So anyway, that's my perspective.
Yeah, I would just say, I'm deeply disappointed in the culture of campus protests, not because I don't think people should be protesting and not because I think it's bad that kids want to lead on issues that are important to them, but because it just looks a lot more like the death of discussion, which is essential to a flourishing anything. And so what I think we see is an inability or an unwillingness of people to actually be in spaces with folks who disagree with them. And that is essential to a healthy democracy. So if you undermine the fundamental conflict, if you want to call it that, the fundamental adversarial relationship that makes things go in the name of oh, you can't be around any ideas that you don't like, then we don't get the society that we want, or at least we don't get the society that we're supposed to be organized around.
Can I just say one thing quickly, which is, obviously we live in a very heated political moment right now, but I keep thinking about where this is all leading. Where are we going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And the one thing that's absolutely certain is that, a lot of us are going to be hopefully still around, but really not off the stage on the ice flow. And a new generation is going to take over, in positions of political leadership and other leadership and so forth. So if we all agree right now that the fact that we all live in bubbles is a big part of the problem we have in our country right now, if there's going to be a solution to that, the solution is going to have to come from the next generation. I don't think there's a time enough left for our generation to solve that problem. So how do you prepare for that? How do you prepare to lead a society where everybody's not living in a bubble, if not to not live in a bubble when you have, the sort of formative educational experience of your young life?
You have a background in the media and journalism, both print and cable news. Mm-hmm. What role do you think media perceptions play in this issue of education reform we're talking about and perception of black America in general? Now we have social media. We can play things in loops forever on our Twitter and our Facebook.
Cat videos.
Cat videos or police shootings, or sometimes I worry that news coverage of something, increased news coverage, gets mistaken for certain trends that may not be there. It's just that we're covering them more. I mean, can you critique the current media environment in that regards?
Well, I've already talked about, polarization, and there's no question that the tone of a lot of political coverage, particularly on television, sort of increases that it's, I won't get deep in the weeds here, but it's economics. It's a lot cheaper to program a 24-hour cable channel with people arguing with each other than actually sending people out to do reporting, and that's been a problem for a while. But I think there's another issue now, which straddles traditional media and social media, which is everybody is performing now. So if you're not performing for a camera, you're kind of curating the persona that you present on Facebook or on Instagram or whatever. And I worry that in addition to the polarization thing, that everybody is so busy sort of posing that it's hard to really sort of have a conversation. And I think that on education in particular, but on a lot of other issues, what's required is a conversation. And it's hard to have a conversation when there's a camera over there and you're kind of preening for the camera. So I think that's a real problem right now.
Darrell, and I want to make sure we leave some time for questions, but I'm not sure how much time I have left. Should we start with how much time do we have for the segment? 25 minutes. Okay. Okay. I'll ask one more question, then we can. You talk a lot about, or you have thought a lot about education reform and opportunities, increasing the opportunities for families to improve their educational situation. But can you talk a little bit about black attitudes towards education? Is that an underlying problem in some communities? You can have the best school in the world right down the street, but if you don't value education, you're not going to take advantage of it. And to what extent do you think that plays a role in some of these achievement gaps we see, the acting white problem, the sort of anti-intellectual strain in the subculture that we find in some ghetto communities? Can you talk at all about that?
So I'd like to thank you for saving the softball question for last. So I do want to say this up top. I think it's not the black community as a problem with attitudes towards education. It's American communities, right? You can see the similar attitudes in lots of different racial subgroups. There's some very high-performing Asian subgroups, and there's some that aren't, right? There's some immigrant black subgroups that knock it out of the, Malcolm Gladwell's written a bunch of stuff about it, really knock it out of the park, and there's some that don't. So I just want to raise the issue that I think as a country, we have a narrative around what education is supposed to mean, and lots of kids don't believe it now. So, it's like you work hard, you move up in the world, you go to college, you get a good job, your life is great. Lots of kids don't believe that narrative because it's just, in a lot of places, it's not true, or it's not accessible in a way that would affirm its value. So I just want to kind of highlight it out there. But I do think about this question often from two ways. I have no idea how I got to college, although I would recommend you have this at the Penn Club sometime instead of at the Harvard Club. But I wish I had a playbook for it, because that would have been really helpful. And I think, and if we were going to have another panelist here who was a co-fellow at the Fordham Institute with me, Ian Rowe, runs a big charter school in the Bronx. And he talks just a lot about like sequencing. You know, there are like a few things you want to do, right? Like there are a few things your parents should want to do before you get here. And then there are a few things you should want to do that, you know, if you put them together, they don't guarantee that things are going to go well, but they mean that things could very likely, you know, go better. And I did not have that sequencing. I sort of like fell into it or fell off of it and whatever. And so I do think one of the things that changes attitudes is when people see a path to doing things and being successful at things. And for lots of black kids growing up in the worst places in America, there's no one who helps put those steps in front of you, or there are very few people who do, in a way that makes it seem accessible. And that has an effect. So I just want to like throw that out there. The other thing though that I also think is really interesting in having this discussion, I want to go full circle on it again, and like the charter school instance, I think, really brings this, shows this in high relief, is that there are folks in communities of color who demonstrably and today want better, right? They have a very strong sense of what going from A to Z should look like. They have very strong values about what that should be. That's not exclusively immigrant communities who are also people of color, who are also black, because there's lots of homegrown black folks who believe these things too. But that is actually, what frustrates me the most is that those attitudes are actually attacked, like often. So if you're a black striver, and you want the school that is best for your kid, people are like, no, you can't do that. Like for you to do that will undermine the republic, right? You got to throw yourself in with this other thing. And so I do think, again, we started this talking about how there are differences in attitude. They might present themselves in class. They might present themselves in public policy. They also present themselves in perception. And like in this instance where education is concerned, I think you see like a bit of a double standard about how black folks want to be successful.
See, I think this is where family is key, because, you know, I mean, what you're describing, I think, in general terms, is something that exists, and it's unfortunate, and it's not, it hasn't always been the case.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. In your study of, you know, early 20th century Black America, did you detect a shift in attitudes on these matters from back then to today?
Oh, yeah, well, look, you know, I mean, one of the reasons, again, that the community that I studied had so much accomplishment was absolutely about education. You know, there were educational opportunities specifically in Pittsburgh that were quite unusual for the time. What's now the University of Pittsburgh, it was called Western University of Pennsylvania at the time. It was supposed to be the Western branch of Penn. Started admitting black students under a scholarship funded by a white abolitionist named Avery in the late 19th century. That's why the guy who ended up turning the Pittsburgh Courier into what it was, Robert L. Vann, actually made his way on his own steam all the way from North Carolina so he could study there. Because of all the Gilded Age money, the Carnegie Mellon Frick money that was in Pittsburgh at the turn of the 20th century, there were two public high schools, which were sort of like early, they didn't have the term magnet school, but they were sort of like magnet schools in Pittsburgh. First Shenley High School and then Westinghouse High School. At the time, were the most expensive public high schools ever built in America. And they both admitted not huge numbers, but maybe 10% of the class, black students, from the very beginning, the 1910s and the 1920s. And it was a huge value. Literacy, musical literacy, that's one of the reasons that they produced, you know, Billy Strayhorn, Billy Eckstine, Mary Lou Williams, Ahmad Jamal, Errol Garner, if you know any of those people, if you're jazz fans, is that there was like this tremendous musical culture of musical appreciation and competition in Pittsburgh. So, you know, our friend Skip Gates, up at Harvard says, you know, we used to be the people of the book, and he means not only just like the Bible, but also, and what happened, you know. So, and I think that something did happen. However, I still see, and I see it. We all see it here in New York. Even in the poorest communities, if you have parents, or you have a grandparent, or you have an aunt, or you have an uncle who really cares about you having an education and is on your butt to get one, those kids can still break through. So, but conversely, if you don't have that, even in the most affluent communities, even white communities and so forth, if you have parents who don't really care about their kids, you see kids who have all the advantages in the world who go nowhere academically. So I think
okay. Well, we're going to open it up for questions if there are any out there. I see a hand in the back, but I don't see a face. Okay.
Good morning. This question is for Mark in particular. Given your status as somebody that was editor-in-chief of Newsweek, I'd be interested to get your perspective on the state of black people in media and journalism. As a young journalist to this day, that is an industry that seems to be almost overwhelmingly white, and a lot of the more prominent African-American figures that we have in journalism tend to be called on to do the race beat, right? So a lot of what they're talking about is race and ethnicity. So I'd be curious to get your take on that.
Well, I think that's true. You know, I mean, the thing about journalism always has been, but it's even more so now, particularly when you're starting out, is there's no one path. And my advice to all young journalists, you know, over the years has always been, when you're starting out, go to the places that will give you the opportunity, right? So in the old days, it was like, don't necessarily go straight to the New York Times. You know, go to a small regional paper. Just because you have more opportunity that you know, at a young age. You know, if you want to be in television, go to a small market where you're just going to get a lot more airtime and a lot more stories and so forth, and then sort of, you know, work your way up to the bigger markets. Now, with the decline of traditional media, but also the rise of all these other forms, that's even more true. I mean, in the terms of having to make your own choices, but also, you know, the variety of places you could work. So what I would say specifically on that issue, I think for black and other minority reporters or women or anybody who's concerned about being pigeonholed or the lack of opportunity, is particularly early on in your career, when you might be single, you might not have, you know, a lot of the kind of financial responsibilities you might have later if you have a family, whatever, that you make those choices based on where you can have the opportunities that you want, right? So if you don't want to be pigeonholed just doing the black story, look around. There are a lot of media, you know, organizations that are actually, you know, still hiring, and where you can get, you know, hired at a, you know, kind of entry level, and choose that. Now, some people want to be doing, you know, the race story, and in that case, there are other places that they can go and find that. So I think that, you know, I could sort of get on my high horse and talk about the responsibility of media organizations to do more hiring and, you know, more promotion and so forth. And I believe that, but it's a little hard given just how the state of the industry right now. But I think from a practical point of view, I think for young journalists, you have to take a little bit of your own initiative to say, what do I really want? I mean, what kind of stories do I really want to be doing? And then see if you can find the institution that might give you those opportunities, and then sell yourself. I mean, then really kind of like make it clear that you really want to, badly want to work for that place.
Right here.
Yes, I'm Michael Myers. I'm the executive director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. My question relates to the larger culture attitude towards what you call self-segregation. Are there any instances, examples, studies that you can tell us about where whites are turned away from tables where black students are sitting? Do you know any studies in that regard? With respect to black housing, so-called black dorms, how do minority students get black dorms without the participation of the college? Are the colleges steering blacks to college to black dorms, or rejecting whites who want to live in black dorms? So my question is the larger culture, the attitude of the whites who reject integration. who reject blacks on campus?
Yeah. I'm trying to dig out the nugget of the question there. I will say this, and I'm not saying this to be tongue in cheek. So like every dorm at Penn is a white dorm except the black one. Right? So I mean, because like we live in a country that is segregated, right? And so like New York City, which per capita should have the most integrated schools in the galaxy, has the most segregated public schools, right? Because there are other factors at play. So I just want to, I totally don't want to answer your question. What I do want to do is just offer that there are other factors at play around like tribalism and sameness. You can assign a benevolent word to it or like a malicious one that create environments where like people might be like, why do black students need a dorm? And then everybody's like, because all the white students already have one. It's called every other dorm. So.
Okay, over here.
Hello, Mr. Riley. At the beginning, you spoke about the statistics which showed great progress for the black community as a whole. I think up to about 1960 was that the cutting point, I believe. You talked about progress in the 1940s, 1950s. What would you attribute to the turnaround in the direction of the black community in America?
Well, what I was really talking about was the economic progress there's a wartime economy. This is a post-World War II prosperity was lifting all boats, including blacks. You had a great migration of blacks out of the South, able to take advantage of higher living standards in the North. I mean, even if you did the same job in Mobile, Alabama versus Detroit, you're going to make much more money doing that job in Detroit. And you had millions of blacks moving into the northern cities, so their standard of living increased. It increased at a faster rate, however, than it did for whites in terms of earnings for both men and women, in terms of increase in educational attainment during this period, entering the skilled professions and so forth. So you had a tremendous amount of progress. And then when you start to look at what starts to happen in the late 60s and 70s and so forth, you start to see a slowing of these trends. I attribute it to a large degree to the Great Society interventions, the expansion of the welfare state, these well-intentioned efforts to help, I think put in place a lot of poor incentives towards work, family formation in particular, and that I think played a role in the slowing of those trends, the stalling of those trends, in some cases, the reversal of those trends.
I mean, one of the things, I agree with some of that, but one of the things that I think is important, Jason raises, to realize, because I think that there's now a lot of literature and discussion that sort of paints a lot of these, government programs as kind of plots against Black America. But most of them did start as sort of kind of liberal New Deal kind of idealistic programs. Another one that I would mention that like overnight changed the trajectory of Black Pittsburgh was urban renewal. Right, and which in Pittsburgh, but in most other cities when it started in the post-war period, was considered something that was going to benefit Black folks. So in the name of that, and there was all this what they called slum clearance money that was made available, by Washington. So if you kind of could make the case that you had a sort of, a Black community in terms of the housing and so forth that was substandard and so forth, you could get a lot of federal dollars to tear it all down and build a spanking new housing project which was supposed to sort of improve the lot of Black America. Well, what happened was two things. One, in Pittsburgh but elsewhere, it was that effort that destroyed you know, the heart of those traditional black neighborhoods. And what were supposed to be these kind of modern, more humane housing projects became prisons. I mean, even worse prisons for the black community than. And if you look at city after city after city, all the way from, you know, the north all the way down to Miami, you know, if you saw Moonlight, you know, it's less of a high rise, but the community that, you know, Barry Jenkins, the director, and the playwright grew up in, and they portray in that movie, is sort of a Florida version of a housing project. So that was a disastrous turn, I think, in terms of, you know, conditions for blacks across the country.